much, Ugo. I'm Devin Madden. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm the Associate Director in our Office of Gender Equity. And for those of you who are new to this space, Amplifying Equity is a speaker series that our office hosts monthly, giving us a chance to really come together and learn from some thoughtful, wise people on topics that we're trying to tackle here, as we want to ensure we have a climate and culture that allows everyone, regardless of gender and identity and expression, to thrive. What I love about this series is that it often gives us the opportunity to reach out to people that we ourselves have been actively learning from. And that's exactly what happened with this month's event. So in addition to my work here at Sinai, I'm also getting my PhD in education and leadership. And I came across Lily's work in a course I was taking this past semester, where we were encouraged to think about how concepts of gender intersect, collide, sometimes crash into concepts of leadership. So if you're here today, you likely read Lily's bio on the invitation, and they asked that I don't spend too much time going into that. But I will just say that I am so humbled to be here in conversation with them today. Lily helps organizations and leaders actually commit to the DEI work that they need to do, and has been named a Forbes D&I Trailblazer, a 2021 DEI Influencer, and a LinkedIn top voice on racial equity. Their work has been featured in the New York Times and NPR, and they have a book called DEI Deconstructed that's right behind them there, that we all need to read over and over. But I came to know of them first from a podcast that they did in 2019 with the Harvard Business Review called There's More to Gender Than Man and Woman. And when I heard the interview, I immediately thought of all of the ways that the binary is rigidly reinforced within academic medicine, and the work that we're doing here at Sinai to get beyond that. So I emailed my gender equity team. I sent them all the link. I had them listen to the podcast. We talked about it, and we wasted no time contacting Lily, inviting them to join us here. So that was a little bit of a long introduction, but here we are, ready to have a fireside chat with Lily Zhang. So Lily, welcome.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Good afternoon, I guess, for folks there. It's 9 a.m. here for me in the San Francisco Bay Area. But yeah, I'm thrilled to talk on this topic. We were talking a bit before the conversation about how, if we wanted, I could just riff on this for like hours. So hopefully this will be a relatively focused conversation on, the most powerful things we can take away from, how the gender binary restricts us, and new ways we can push past our current plateau or stagnation of progress towards gender equity.
Yeah, I'm really excited to dive into all of that. I was going to kick us off just asking you to share a little bit about your journey into this world of advocacy and education, and ask you to think about what led you to dive into helping others dissect and understand the ways in which gender stereotypes really hold us back. But I want to take a moment to just ground us more in the present, because you are in California, your day is just starting. And before we get into the heady stuff, I'd just like to know, what does a regular morning look like for Lily Zhang? Do you have any routines that you
Good question.
do to get your head into the game?
Yeah, well, I wake up at the same time every morning, wake up my wife, then we have breakfast together. And then so I have a very scheduled week. So some of my mornings start with like, I'm going to do some writing, and I'm going to like draft a post for the day. I did that today, actually. It's a Thursday. Thursday is LinkedIn day. So 30 minutes before this call, I wrote a LinkedIn post and shot it off, and here I am. And then on different days, I think on Wednesday mornings, I'm going bouldering now. So that's exciting. So now I just start my day off with some exercise. That's fun. Take my Fridays off of work, which is good. So, 4-day weekends, they're very important. Well, 3-day weekends are what most people get. I'm trying a 4-day weekend, which is kind of nuts. But, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. That's a very long answer.
No, but it's great to hear
Yeah.
about all of the balance that you're weaving in. So thanks for sharing that. All right, so now we need to know what got you into the work that you do today, around DEI in general, but also around gender more specifically.
Yeah, so I got into gender-related advocacy before DEI writ large. It's no secret. I'm a trans person. I use they, them pronouns. 3 or 4 years ago, I was using she, her pronouns and identifying as a trans woman. So I've been steeped in trans advocacy since I transitioned in high school. I was one of the first trans people. I think I was the first trans person in my high school to transition, and always had a very strong interest in understanding, how it is we can create environments that are more supportive for trans folks. Partially motivated by the fact that I didn't really have too many of those. So, it started from a personal place, saying, why are these places just not built for people like me? And then realizing that this isn't just a personal issue anymore. Now this is a much larger issue of like, how can we design spaces? How can we design organizations? How can we make a better society for trans folks? And that's kind of how I got my start in the DEI space. I taught trans workshops for years and years. Trans advocacy was sort of my thing. And the reason why I made the shift over from teaching only on trans issues to, really tackling DEI writ large is I started recognizing that the sources of inequity and the solutions that we needed to create together to address it were very similar. I was doing a lot of learning, right, in my own undergraduate and graduate programs about how, the different forms of inequity in the world, right, whether racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, ableism, and so on, intersect, and how the experiences of marginalized groups, especially multiply marginalized groups, who belong in many different marginalized communities, have these experiences that over and over again reflect the same patterns. And so I started thinking to myself, right, like, I don't necessarily think I would just want to stay in this small box of like, oh, Lily's a trans person that wants to make things better for trans people. If the things that I'm pushing for, right, challenging the gender binary, thinking of more expansive ways to be in the world, taking down prescriptive gender stereotypes and making more space for all people, and then also at the same time designing organizations that support these cultural shifts in terms of writing better policies, designing better processes, creating organizational culture, facilitating inclusive leadership. Like, that's not just a trans-specific thing at this point. That's a broader foray into what we now call diversity, equity, and inclusion work. So that's sort of the condensed version of things. It's been a move that I've been steadily making for, I guess, the last like 6 or 7 years. I think it's funny you mentioned that 2019 podcast, 'cause I think that was like one of the last things I did where I was like, Lily's the trans expert focusing on gender. Because from that point, I was like starting to move into also talking about things like racial equity and disability justice, and all of these things are interconnected, right? And maybe that's something we can get into today as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, that considering the intersectionality is super important, and the many ways in which we experience our identities and the ways in which our identities are either weaponized or not seen or are viewed as limitations. I think there's a lot to consider beyond gender. But I really appreciated from that conversation the way in which you really articulated how trans people and non-binary people are becoming more seen. And as that is happening, there is this tension that is emerging in workplaces, largely from cisgender people who are like, I don't know what to do with this. I don't know how to create spaces for people who are gender expansive. And you talk a lot about how that tension is actually a reflection of cisgender people being so constricted to their own boxes, and seeing this opportunity kind of freaks them out because they may not have realized all of the ways in which they had to force themselves into a box that might be getting uncomfortable for them, right? So I've heard you talk about how we've built boxes around gender that we conform to, and that this in some ways may be a survival tactic, especially in workplaces where institutions seem to reward people who act according to how they're expected based on the box that they came to work in, right?
Mhm.
And we see that in academic medicine, and it's probably not unlike some of what you've seen across the industries that you work with. So we know that women don't negotiate because they don't want to seem too aggressive. If women are assertive, they're really just being bitchy. If a man shows any sign of softness, he's not a strong leader. We talked yesterday, Lily, about men being afraid to take parental leave benefits, right? But I'd love to hear you talk just a little bit more about some of the quiet, subtle, but really pervasive ways that these rigid norms show up in the workplace, and why thinking that if we just go along with these norms we're protecting ourselves isn't actually true.
Right. That's such a good question. And to start understanding it, let's get to the heart of like what are these prescriptive gender norms and stereotypes, right? When we talk about the gender binary, it's not this objective truth that there are only two genders in the world. There's a whole section in my first book, Gender Ambiguity in the Workplace, on the social construction of medical gender. But even getting away from that, gender norms are the ideas we've constructed as a society around the difference between men and women, right? The socially constructed differences between men and women, not just our ideas about how men and women should be, but going all the way back to what we think men and women are at their core, right? There's and it's pernicious, true, because it goes all the way back to our childhood. It goes all the way back to how we are communicated to in school. I mean, it goes back to like how babies are gendered, right? Like you can talk about the language parents use to describe newborns or infants or toddlers, right? Who have no conception of anything, let alone gender, right? Like they don't have object permanence. Like how are they supposed to understand gender norms? And yet we use these ideas of oh, you're such a big, strong little man, right? Or oh, you're such a kind, gentle, caring little lady. And also, on top of that, impose a whole bunch of things around compulsory heterosexuality, fat phobia, ableism. We put a whole bunch on babies, and that just continues and continues as they get older. Now, we're not doing this because parents have some evil agenda to like train their children to mold them into these shapes, but because that's what many people like, that's what we ourselves have experienced growing up. And so we teach ourselves, well, I feel terrible for this, but I want to teach my daughter to fit into these norms because that's just the world around us. Like I'm preparing her to live in a world that's going to be treating her awfully unless she knows how to do this. Or I don't like the fact that I'm being really hard on my son right now, but like he has to learn that out there, if men show weakness, like he's going to get eaten. So I have to teach him to be strong and rough, even if it breaks my heart to do so. And generationally, right? Like generation after generation, like you can, maybe this is a bit of a stretch. You can even think of gender norms as like perhaps one of the longest lasting forms of generational trauma in the world, right? Because that's exactly what it is. We are passing on our ideas about how people need to be to survive in the world onto our kids, and that gets reified in our workplaces, in our institutions, in our legal system, in our schools, right? And in every aspect of how people grow up. And it doesn't necessarily serve us very well, right? There's a concept from social psychology that I like coming back to. It's called pluralistic ignorance. I'll define it. It was first developed in a study looking at college drinking. So I'll make the connection soon. The idea being that when you ask undergraduate college students what percent of other college students they think condone drinking heavily, everybody overestimates it. Everybody says, oh, like everyone here loves drinking. Everybody here loves it. So like, even if I don't love it, like I know everyone else loves it, so I should probably engage in some social drinking. The interesting thing is the vast majority of people right? The majority of people do not want to drink, but overestimate the percentage of everyone else who wants to drink. So essentially, it's a whole campus of people who don't really want to drink who say, well, I'm doing so because everyone else wants to. And I bring up this example because gender norms are in many ways the exact same thing. Like there are some women, there are some men who say, hey, gender stereotypes, I love them, they serve me, they're so good. But I think they're the minority. I think the vast majority of men, women, and people of all genders say, these aren't great. These don't serve me. I'm doing them partially because that's what I've been taught, but also partially because I believe that everyone else expects me to do so, right? And that's interesting because if the majority of people don't subscribe to these norms, then perhaps we can shift their behavior by opening them up to the fact that these are prescribed, created norms. These don't have to be the way society is constructed, right? I am going to a completely different example. There's a great chart that, or a graph rather, that I remember seeing about the rates of left-handedness. And it starts really, really low. And then at some point in time, it jumps, right? It starts to like 0% and then jumps to like 10% or something like that. And people go like, oh, what happened to create all these left-handed people? The only thing that changed was the criminalization of left-handedness, right? Like before that, it's not that left-handed people didn't exist. It's that they were forced to pretend to be right-handed people. Right. And, things that metaphor is often compared to the rates of that's used as a metaphor for trans people in today's society. Right. Why are there so many more trans people now? Because it's safer this statement was true a couple of years ago. It's safer to be trans now than it was, a long time ago. It's kind of messy right now. But I'm sharing all these stories to say, gender norms are things that constrict us, that we have created to constrict us. And partially because we've created them, we can also uncreate them, right? And that's the promise. That's the exciting aspect of this kind of work.
And I think as you're talking, Lily, that's the promise of seeing more trans and non-binary people share their identities with the world. It gives other people a chance to reflect on who they are, how they want to show up. As you're talking, I think one of the things that comes up for me is that there has been this enculturation of who you are based on your gender from a very young age. I've heard somewhere too, someone talk about like with babies, it's like, oh, you're a strong boy, you're a good boy, you're a sweet boy, any adjective before boy. But the thing they get over and over and over again is boy, right? And so they start to really forget all the other adjectives, but try to put meaning to what boy means, because that's the one they hear over and over and over again. So that said, we get a lot of practice with our gender role. It becomes a skill, if you will, that we cultivate, right? And we wear it as an armor out in the world so that people treat us based on this code that we've established. So with all of that said, how do we practice taking off some of that armor? And how do we practice taking off some of that armor and be authentic to who we really feel we might be if we don't have systems in place, particularly in workplaces, or leaders who are ready to be supportive of trying on, practicing with our more authentic selves?
Yeah, great question. I'm going to use the metaphor you used, calling it armor, right? Armor, if you're on a battlefield in a war, serves a purpose. It's very useful. I don't want someone to take off their armor if they are actively on a battlefield, right? And so the idea being that we can't just single-mindedly push people to say, oh, embrace your authentic selves. Don't prescribe to gender norms. Do whatever the heck you want, right? Because the other reality is that most people are working and living in environments that don't support that. And so for me, the question isn't how can we encourage people to take off their armor, but how can we end the battle, right? How can we end the war? so that armor isn't necessary anymore. Now, that's a long conversation, how we like create a better society, but we can create microcultures that essentially give each other reprieves from that. And we can create relationships, communities, micro environments, right? Maybe just on a team or in a department or even on a working group of 2 or 3 people where the expectations are different. And that, I think, is extremely powerful, because now we're not saying, women, you have to change your entire organization before you can let go of these gender norms. That's really hard. Instead, we're saying, how can you create the shared expectation among just a small group of people? It can even be 2 people, 3 people, that says, I see you, you see me, we're going to create a new expectation for our working relationship, where I don't have to be like this, you don't have to be like that. And we're going to try to model, even in this very micro level interaction between 2 people or 3 people, what a better culture, what a better set of expectations around gender norms might look like. I mean, it feels really small, right? But that's where it starts. When we can create reprieve in just those small microcultures, we can scale up. We can say, look, on this team, I can't do anything about, our broad 2,000 person company, but on this team of 10 people, like, this is what's going to be rewarded. Like, we're going to make space for emotion. We're going to make time to contemplate the impacts of the work that we're doing on people, right? We are not going to push people to overwork. We're going to really encourage balance and flexibility and help each other take care of our responsibilities to our families and our loved ones, right? On this team, that's what flies, right? And that permission is something that's created, yes, by a leader and by a manager and someone who's setting those expectations, but it's also something co-created by everyone on that team. And you can imagine that scaling up and scaling up, right? It gets harder and harder the further up you go, but that's something we can do today. And so the challenge to all of you, right, is not how can you let go of your armor? It's how can you create space around you in your relationships where that armor starts to seem unnecessary, right? Because if you go a day without someone going for you, right, and using that armor, then you might feel, oh, that's a fluke. If you go a week, then you're like, wow, that's interesting. If you go a month, you're like, I don't think I need this armor here. And so creating those long-term experiences, really starting to undo what we've learned as self-protective instincts, right, is what everyone can do. And I want to note briefly, you mentioned something about, trans and non-binary people sort of showing new ways to be. I think one of the largest tensions, and we're seeing this play out in real time in society right now with all the, with the recent persecution of the trans community in the last few years, is the fact that for trans folks, right, many times, this isn't true for every trans person, but many times trans people have to be their authentic selves, right? Many folks come out because what they were forced to present as is so intolerable that regardless of the consequences, they need to present as what feels more authentic. It's the equivalent of, in the war zone, taking off all of your armor. And that's terrifying. It's really dangerous, right? And for many trans folks, unfortunately, they experience high rates of discrimination as a result. So I don't want to sugarcoat that, right? I don't want to be like, trans people are these enlightened gender beings that just have a great time because they cast off the change of gender. That's not true, because trans folks are still operating in this highly gendered environment, and their efforts to create that authenticity for themselves often make them a target from those around them who have not done the work to start creating environments where they can take off their armor, or who have internalized, like, this isn't armor, this is my skin, this is who I am, right? I can't take it off. And that's a long conversation. I'm seeing a hand from the audience. You want to take questions?
Let's go to Carlos. I think Carlos, you can, go ahead.
Hi, how are you? Yes, my name is Carlos. So yeah, I have a question. So I guess I'm a little confused on my end. I feel like as managers, we have to kind of be a bit detached, not inhuman or not empathetic, but that we kind of have to keep a separation of of the individual's choices and be as neutral as possible. But as managers, to try to be more inclusive, I feel like there's always this barrier that I don't want to cross out of fear of getting in trouble, or where you may try to feel like you're coming off as empathetic, that to be misinterpreted as uncomfortable, I guess, intimacy that an employee may not want to, for a manager to be able to discuss and to get to that level, I guess, or that type of relationship. So then, I guess, do you have any suggestions on how to build kind of those small groups and then develop it larger as a manager, while also having the manager not feel worried about, I guess, getting in trouble for maybe being too friendly or too pushy, and not really intending for it to be misinterpreted as something else?
That's a really good question. Thank you for asking that, Carlos. I think first things first, I want to speak to the fact that the role of manager is evolving in today's society, right? I think increasingly we're seeing people expect that managers don't just coordinate work, right, which is, I think, the more traditional understanding, but also remove barriers for their teams, ensure team success, right, and speak to the more human aspect of the work. We're basically putting more on managers than we ever have before, and that's a challenge. I definitely want to note that and say that things are tough for managers. Now, to create those sorts of environments, I think it's more simple than it sounds, right? You basically say, look, team, here's my team. This is the outcome that I want. I want an outcome where people can bring their best selves to work. And I want to make sure, because we're at work, we're focusing on work. I want to make sure everyone has what they need to succeed at work. And for some people, what they need to succeed at work is don't talk about identity, don't talk about gender, don't talk about race, right? Just focus on the outputs that I'm producing. That's, I think, that's in line with the more traditional way of thinking about work. And for many other people, increasingly in today's society, who they are can't be disentangled from their work, right? We are seeing, for example, now, if there's been like a mass shooting in the news, if there's been a hate crime against an Asian person in the news, right? Like, I can't separate that from who I am. I'm going to come to work and try to do my best doing work, but have all of this as a cloud in my mind. I'm not going to be productive. I'm not going to be able to do my best work. And so we're increasingly seeing workplaces and leaders and managers recognize this and say, I know that we're not all here at work to talk politics all day, but we're also not immune to the fact that, like, we're working in this broader cultural context. And, as individuals, we are bringing our lives into our workplaces. This is more and more true for millennials and Gen Z, for example, who have less of that separation of, like, this is my work persona, this is my personal life. Now, like, work and personal life are very much blurred. And so these are the new challenges, I think, of managing in today's environment. The fact that these social issues that we might have seen before as not related to work are now very much work-related issues. And so the bar for managers has gone up. Before, it was like, don't talk about politics, manage the work. Easy peasy, right? And now it's manage the work and manage the fact that we are living in a society that's grappling with racism and sexism, transphobia, homophobia, ableism, etc. And we're trying to make space for people with social identities that are being persecuted, as soon as they walk out the door of the office, and oftentimes in the office itself, right? If your employee is facing discrimination at work, then suddenly, like, that's very personal to them. And as a manager, right, like, it's going to increasingly be your job to support across this wide range of circumstances. So I think that's a really good question. It speaks to the changing nature of the fact that we're having this conversation as it relates to workplaces and not just broader society.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carlos. If other folks have questions, feel free to raise your hand, or you can start to put them in the chat. I want to touch on some of what I actually think Carlos's question also touched on, which was this polarization. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of tension. People want to do the right thing. People think other people are going too far with all of this. There's just a lot of dialogue that's really disruptive and, quite frankly, distracting to creating a culture that everyone can thrive in. I shared with you that, for International Women's Day, the Global Institute for Women's Leadership issued an international report that they did where they surveyed folks across a bunch of different countries on gender equity issues. And when I was reading through the report, what struck me was that in the United States, 45% of the men who were surveyed agreed that men are being expected to do too much to support equality, right? That this is really hard work and they're being asked to do too much. I think we've heard that people feel as though the tide is sort of turning and now we're discriminating against cis men, right? Further disheartening was that 27% of women also agreed. So I would love to hear you talk through how we talk to each other through the noise, how we just kind of get through to one another in more vulnerable and honest ways that don't alienate each other, because I think sometimes we're really good at fighting each other and not fighting for each other. So I'd love to just hear your thoughts on that.
Fully agree with that. That's a really good question. So I'm not surprised by those numbers. I think they come, to me at least, they come from a place of seeing gender equity work as a zero-sum game and seeing this idea that, men have what they have for whatever reason, right? Maybe we acknowledge that there's some privilege. Maybe we say, it's privilege plus I worked hard, right? Maybe some people say, well, there's no privilege, I just worked hard. Either way, men have what they have. And there's this perception that, for women to experience better, we need to take things from men and give it to women, that it's going to be a zero-sum game, that for women to benefit, men have to lose. And it's rhetoric, right, that I think not enough people push back against on enough. And part of this is we're not able to imagine a future that's better for men than it is now, right? So oftentimes we say, like, things are perfect for men and awful for women. Let's just talk about women. And a lot of the men who I've talked to and who I see, research about, there's a great study on, it's called the White Men's Leadership Study, talking about like white men's participation in DEI work. But essentially, like, white men are saying, look, I care a lot about this. Things aren't incredible for me too, right? Like, as a man, these gender norms hurt me. For example, like you mentioned in the very beginning, it's extremely difficult to express emotion. It's extremely difficult to talk about mental health outcomes, extremely difficult to talk about supporting your family, to talk about needing to care for yourself, showing emotion. These are all negative aspects of gender norms that affect men. We can also talk about work-related outcomes. Men overwork a lot. Like, it's a very gendered thing. People of all genders overwork, but men overwork the most. Why? Is it because men are naturally born to be more? No, absolutely not. It's because we've created societal expectations that say we need to have one breadwinner, which is the man, and you need to be bringing in the bacon for your family. And like, that's how it works. And so if women, belong at home raising the children, men belong at work, overworking until they drop of exhaustion. And that's a model that obviously hurts women and is discriminatory and sexist towards women. And we don't talk about this enough, is extremely hard on men. There are studies that show the burden of needing to live up to these unrealistic expectations that were made hundreds and hundreds of years ago, not relevant to today's society, where you need dual breadwinner households, for example, because late capitalism is just this messed up. But we haven't created space for men to recognize that like these issues are things that benefit them as well. Gender equity is seen as a women's issue, and that's, I think, a problem, because gender equity isn't just about bringing men, it's never been about bringing men down, but it's not just about raising women up to the level of men. It's about rethinking how gender affects all of us so that we can imagine a better future for, yes, women, but also men and people of all genders as well. It's a failure of imagination, I think, especially for those who are communicating about these issues and pushing them forward, and engaging with men as allies. Like everything I've seen, every event I've seen catering to men as allies is all about like, here's how you can help women. Here's how you can help women. And maybe this isn't kosher to say, but like, where's the stuff about like self-interest? Like, where's the stuff about like men helping themselves, right? Like everyone wants to know that there's something in it for them. And there's so much that gender inequity does to hurt people of all genders that I think we're just missing a huge opportunity to reframe this work as, yes, being beneficial to women, but also being in men's self-interest as well, right? And if we can do that and, you know, talk about women as well, and we can help women understand that, you know, this better future that we can imagine will give you more than upholding these gender norms in the present, then I think we'll get somewhere really interesting, right? Because like you said, 20-something% of women think that they're being asked to do too much to support gender equity, right? They're just like, no, I love these restrictive ideas about needing to take care of children as my sole life's purpose. I don't know, right? People tell themselves the wildest things because that's self-protective for them. So rather than shame them for self-protecting, let's go back to this armor analogy. How can we end the war, right? How can we make people feel like they're no longer needing this armor to survive? And that's a question for those who are building, right? That's a question for leaders who build organizations, for managers who build team environments. And we can all create spaces where everyone's armor is unnecessary, then I think we'll start seeing some more progress. You're muted.
Yep. To your point, Lily, I think going back to what you were saying earlier too about the many social identities we hold, it's true across the board. If we all work together and recognize and honor the many identities that we hold and the many ways in which we want to be seen, we can get somewhere that's better for everyone. So I really appreciate that. I want to remind folks that if they have questions, they can raise their hand or put them in the chat. But Lily, I want to ask you about what keeps you motivated as you do this work. You know, you talked a little bit about how some of this is really making these incremental changes and hoping that they become scalable and trusting that they will, that they're transformational in individuals' lives, but that they can be transformational on a bigger scale too. But I'd love to know just how you stay motivated as you see things progressing more or less slowly, and also in the face of all of the anti-trans legislation that is coming out. So just a little bit about like the hope and maybe share a recent win that you've witnessed that makes you excited for the changes you believe are still to come.
Sure. So talking about hope, I'm actually not a huge believer in just having hope based on incremental small wins. I think there are many other ways we can create change in society. And one of the reasons why I'm doing the work that I'm doing, working with organizations, nonprofits, higher ed and institutions, corporations, is because I believe that there's a faster pace of change than we can achieve just at the individual granular level. For example, if organizations are able to do pay equity audits, they get super valuable information about how and where and why pay equity exists in their organization so that they can take steps to back pay and fix these issues, right? Pay equity audit. I think that's easier than going into every single person's hearts and minds and changing them to address individual bias at scale. Like, if you ask me which one I'd prefer to do, I'm going to do the pay equity audit every single time. And I think this is the kind of like DEI work. I haven't talked much about like the work that I do when I'm not talking about trans issues and these sorts of things, but that's why I do DEI work, because there are like really, really powerful high impact things you can do within organizations that can dramatically accelerate the pace of equity work. That might look like new policies. That can also look like changing processes. For example, there's a lot of discrimination and bias in hiring and promotion, right? We see these negatively impact women, of course, also, people of color, disabled folks, LGBTQ plus folks, and those who are in the intersections of all of those identities. Again, I guess I could talk to every single recruiter in the world and hope to change their hearts and minds. I don't particularly want to do that. And it turns out if you do something as basic as creating hiring rubrics, requiring decisions, use hiring panels, really, quantifying and making operational our expectations for the skills and responsibilities required for a role, that actually mitigates a huge amount of discrimination, not because you've solved people's biases in their brains, but because you've just given them tools to mitigate it in terms of their outcomes. So I love this kind of stuff. And, those topics are actually what I talk about most of the time when I'm giving talks like these, because they present paths forward for us that don't just involve sitting here and hoping that we can just talk to enough people to create change at scale. I think that needs to happen, right? We can't stop talking to people, but we can also recognize that there are ways to do this work really effectively, starting from the top and targeting the systems that already exist, right?
Yeah. And I think that's a lot of the work that we in our Office of Gender Equity are trying to do with others across the institution, thinking about the search committees that we have and what are the guidelines that they're following. So, and then, also thinking through what are our policies and do people know about them? Are they adequately amplified so that people can take advantage of them without having to wade through all of the papers?
Let me share an example.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So you also asked about wins, recent wins. And I was just reading about this a couple weeks ago. I think Australia finally passed like a really big law expanding parental leave policies to all genders. And this is really powerful. There's been some really interesting research in the last 10 years talking about parental leave policy. Essentially, if there is an unequal parental leave policy, let's say there's a maternal leave policy of X number of hours, and there's either no paternal leave policy or a much lesser one, that actually exacerbates gender norms because it contributes to this idea that like, oh, women need to take time off from work and they get this resource because they don't have to be working, but men don't get it because men need to be working. That actually worsens inequity, right? It's a benefit that was designed to address it, but it worsens it by playing into these gender norms. And so all the research out there says that if you want to actually decrease gender norms and improve things for families and newborns and parents of all kinds, you need to offer, parity with your parental leave policy. You need to make sure that all the parents involved can get what they need. And ideally, it's a use it or lose it policy that basically says this is the amount of hours you have available. You get the most leave possible, paid leave, if both parents utilize the policy. You can't transfer hours to another parent, like you can't bank them. You have to use it or lose it. And some companies do things like if all parents use the policy, then they get even bonus hours of leave, right? Like incentive systems that are designed to encourage that sort of behavior rather than worsening gender norms. And essentially, Australia passed a law. They talked about it last October, I think. They recently passed a law in March that dramatically expanded parental leave policies for both parents. And that's a huge win. I think that happened in March or something, right? So we're seeing progress, and we're seeing not just progress in a misguided way, but progress that draws on this really critical and crucial and necessary research. So love that. US is a bit far behind in terms of legally mandated parental leave, but there are good things happening in the world. We just have to learn from them.
But how do we, and I see, Jonathan, I see your hand, so I want to go to you in a moment, but I do want to just ask how we encourage use of the policy, leverage of the policy across genders, because I think what has happened is that people have seen the ways in which taking parental leave has hurt women's careers historically. And they're like, okay, I know it's being offered to me, but going back to all the things I've been taught and all the things I've seen, I'm not going to take it. Right.
Yeah.
I'm a cis man and I'm not going to take it because I don't want this to be used against me. How do we, yes, we offer it. How do we encourage it?
Yes. Okay. So this is talking about culture, how we create a different culture. There's a, how do I not say this in jargon? Okay, I'm gonna use a little bit of jargon. Making the taking, nope, doesn't sound good already. Make the act of taking parental leave a high status act. So talking about status is essentially the ideas we have about people who do a particular thing. So right now, taking parental leave is a low status thing. Like if you take parental leave, it reflects that like you are not committed to work. That's the biggest association of taking parental leave. And that association is exacerbated for men because it's seen as a gendered thing. So if women take parental leave, it's like, oh, it's expected because they're women. But if men take parental leave, it's like, oh, that's a huge violation because like that's a women's act and men are supposed to focus on work. So if we want to change that status association, we need to basically, this sounds very counterintuitive, celebrate the hell out of men who take parental leave. Because by focusing on the people who embody the low status norm and flipping the script, right? Like this sounds very weird from a DEI perspective, but like I want to put every man who's ever taken parental leave up on a stage, put them on a pedestal and give them bonuses. Kind of sounds weird, sounds counterintuitive, but that I think is one of the most powerful things we can do to change the status norm and make it so taking leave is seen as perhaps, right, an indication of someone who really values wellness, who really values themselves, who cares about work-life balance, who is really loyal to the organization, who cares about things outside of their work. And maybe we can create a new identity of a worker who is both really productive and also cares about society and family and themselves. And that's something we can celebrate within a workplace, right?
Yeah.
That's tough. It's difficult. It's weird, right? But
comfortable, right?
It's super uncomfortable. But I think to flip the script of these sort of status related norms, we do need to take steps like that, which are going, which, I can already see the quotes from this talk, right? Like Lily thinks we should give men bonuses for taking paternal leave, like incredible, right? Like bizarre. But I think that's how we do this, right? And we make more space for people of all genders to utilize something as basic as a policy or a benefit or a resource, so that I think, at scale, this is going to dramatically lower the costs associated with taking leave, regardless of your gender, which I think is hugely beneficial for gender equity efforts.
Yeah. Thank you, Lily. Okay, Jonathan, go ahead.
Hi, Lily. Thank you for your talk today. I'm curious as to how do you tackle the conversation around the religious barriers towards, opening up the authenticity towards various groups in the workplace. I grew up in the church, but, through a lot of the guidance and a lot of the information I'm hearing relative to, points around DEI, it kind of has shifted my reality around, of course, what it means to be a man. You can cry a little bit, you can do these things. You don't have to, like you said, you don't have to be the ultimate breadwinner. I'm challenged on that point because I am the breadwinner right now, but I want to take a break from it. But there's no way out, unfortunately.
Feel that, yeah.
But the thing is, how do you want to protect those folks on your team as well that come from those backgrounds that are heavy in the church and all those deals, but you also need to make sure you support diversity, you support those initiatives. So I know it's a very sensitive topic, but I'm just interested in how do you open those conversations up to show that everybody's protected in the space in that regard.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And it's at the forefront of a lot of current DEI conversations because we want to make space for everybody, but there are challenges when different groups that we want to make space with have historically been at odds with each other. Right. And so one of the ways I've seen, and I've advised the companies that I work with on this, is you set baseline expectations for what an inclusive workplace looks like. And so those expectations might include things like you cannot misgender people. You cannot discriminate against people because of their religion. You cannot, talk crap about people's identities. And just focusing on those behaviors, right? Focusing on, we're not here in this workplace to legislate what kind of person you're allowed to be, but rather we're here to create some shared expectations so we can get our work done effectively together. And that means making space for people who might have very divergent political views, because we don't care about political differences, but what we do care about is harmful behavior. And I'll say this, right? Like, I've seen people from completely opposite ends of the political aisle work effectively together because they have these shared expectations for what goes at work, what behavior is reasonable, right? And I think that's what we need to focus on here, rather than saying like you need to be a good person to work here, because that gets into very complicated topics of like, well, we can't be telling people, right, how, like, what to believe in terms of their religion. We can't legislate like what people feel about themselves or other people around them, but we can set expectations for behavior at work. And so when we can focus on that and say, look, on this team, I know that we all have opinions about these hot button issues, but we're going to focus on what behaviors make people in this room right now feel like they belong, feel like they're included, and feel like this workplace is a place for them. Even if they don't agree on anything, there will always be a lowest common denominator of shared expectations and shared behavior. And that, I think, if we focus on, we can not necessarily avoid, but we won't get caught up as much in the culture wars, right? Saying like, you're a good person if you believe this, you're a bad person if you believe that. I truly do believe that we can get past a lot of the polarization and just focus on, we're people here and we might have different needs, but I think we can create some shared expectations for how we can work effectively together.
Thank you.
So we have a couple of comments and a question in the chat that I think I'm going to close this out with because we have only 5 minutes left. But Jill says, Jill Gregory, this is a reflection going back to what you were talking about with the work culture. Grind culture in the US and in New York City specifically, that working crazy hours is admired. I think beyond men taking parental leave, we need male leaders to model this behavior and women leaders too. And then Lisa Karger asks, I'd like to hear thoughts on the challenges of leaders encouraging wellness and balance given the current economic environment where there is a push to work more with less, particularly from the perspective of those who are not the leaders with power, i.e. a section leader, but not a division chief or a departmental leader.
Okay, I love both of these questions because they speak to a very common myth in US society, which is that working more produces more. It's kind of outrageous. There's a very classic HBR study, that's name I'm now forgetting. It's something like overwork is unproductive or something, that says when you work, your productivity peaks at around 30 hours or so, and then just takes a nosedive straight into the dirt. Like working past 50 hours a week for the vast majority of people, not only destroys your well-being, your sense of balance, and pretty much everything else in your life, but also doesn't actually result in anything better for your organization, right? So if we are being as cold, hard, rational, and logical as possible, then we wouldn't be overworking. Like we would all be having 3-day weekends and 30-hour work weeks, not because we're being sort of, we don't care, like, let's take it easy, kick our feet back, but because that's actually peak productivity. Like it's nuts. Like that's peak productivity. The reason why we have these overwork cultures is because, talk about status again, overwork is tied to our perception of value in US society. And so people will do busy work on purpose, or change their status to busy, or inflate the hours that they work. There's also another HBR study that showed that men falsify their hours to show them as dramatically higher, right, if they can get away with it, because it's just seen as a beneficial thing. even if they're not actually producing anymore, right? And like this is a shared, like it's a shared delusion. It's pluralistic ignorance. Everybody believes that everybody else gets more done if they just clock in more hours. So they push themselves half to death, clocking in more hours, hustling, grinding, doing all that, not actually producing too much more, by the way, and dramatically hurting themselves in the process. So what do we do about it? I think there are some generational shifts, right? Something I see as really promising is Gen Z in particular, and definitely millennials to some extent, are less a fan of that now, right? There's more recognition that like, I don't actually think this helps me or anyone else, and I'm not here to do it, right? That's powerful. I think talking about the economy, this is a long conversation. I think fear of the economy has been leveraged to do pretty much anything, right? Like if I didn't want to take out the trash right now, I could say, you know, in this economic environment, like it's just too risky to take out the trash. Like you can use it to justify anything. And I'll just say like this fear that like we need to do more with less, like that's the arbitrary constructed thing. We always have the ability to create the culture we want. And I worry sometimes, well, I worry all the time that leaders today are using anything as an excuse to get back to the command and control methods of 10 years ago, because they're scared of what we can create, right? That's one of the reasons why we're seeing all of these return to office mandates. That's one of the reasons why we're seeing the rollback of flexible working arrangements, remote working arrangements. One of the reasons why we're seeing DEI roles get let go, right? Because, oh, in this economic environment, we simply must reverse every single gain we've made in the last 10 years because think of the economy, right? And we need to push past that fear. Like we need to stay steady on this idea that a better future is possible, and not just regress back to how we were in the past. Like the good old days were only good for a very small amount of people. And we have to imagine that the future can be better than that.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Lily. This has been an incredible hour. You've given us so much food for thought. I know folks want to know how they can keep learning with and from you. So if you could share your socials, that would be great. And any other news that you want to share before we close out, I just want to say thanks again.
Yeah, you can follow me on LinkedIn at Lily Zhang, and find me on, I don't really post on social media outside of LinkedIn, so just start there for now. And if you want to learn more about me and my work, you can go to my website at lilyzhang.co. And if you'd like to support my book, you'll find links to it plastered all over my site and my LinkedIn and all that. So thanks so much for joining this conversation. I hope it was informative and interesting for all of you. I look forward to, I don't know, hearing about the ways in which y'all make space in your own lives to take off that armor and to just imagine a future that's better than what we have now, and that's certainly better than what we had 10, 20 years ago.
Yes, I'm all for that. You're getting a lot of great kudos in the chat, and we're just so appreciative for this time. Thanks, Lily. Thanks everyone for joining. Stay in touch with the Office of Gender Equity, and we'll talk soon.